So since our last session, someone came up with the term commitment, not just cheerleading. And one of the things that I hope that we all can get out of today is get a little bit closer to the specifics and the details, and get a little bit more alignment on next steps, organization building, financing models, funding models, and also have you guys representing very different organizations and very different roles to actually be able to lean in and say yes, and maybe no. It's good to have cheerleaders. It's better to have action heroes. At least that's my take. So before we start, just a quick recap. For those of you that are just joining, we would really appreciate it if you could play around with your Zoom profile. Rename yourself to your first name, last name, fine. And also add the organization, or in some exotic cases, just add your countries. It helps people understand who are we speaking with when we go into the breakout groups in a second. So welcome everyone. And just like last time, we're going to be working on Zoom, which we're all logged into. And we're also going to be working on Miro. Now, a very important message, very practical. If you know how to use and operate Miro, you can just dive right in. If you are new to Miro or you haven't really sort of found your way around it, don't worry, because in the breakout groups, your team leader will be sharing his or her screen. So technically, you don't have to do anything on Miro more than engage in the conversation. However, we would encourage you to get active and actually contribute by working in Miro. That's completely up to you how you would like to approach that. What we would like to see for all groups is a lot of content, a lot of discussion, and a lot of points. So when we proceed, we will actually have something that looks like this: a massive knowledge and insights exercise from you guys in the various breakout sessions we're going to be doing today. And over to you, Mayor. What are we going to be doing today?
Well, thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Lisa Helps, the Mayor of Victoria. Happy to have you all here. I'm here this morning on the homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people in the city of Victoria. So what we are doing today is continuing the work of the first two workshops, which really is to build a short, medium, and long-term plan to grow the ocean economy in our region, on our island, and essentially in the province and the country as well. This plan that we're working on together with you today comes out of Victoria 3.0, which is the city's 20-year economic action plan to recover from the pandemic, reinvent who we are beyond just tourism and the public sector. And we've got lots of tech already, obviously. I don't want to not nod to the tech industry, but we are we've got amazing assets in the ocean and marine sector, but we're not, I don't think, pulling those all together as well as we could, which is the whole point of this project that we're working on with you. But the context is Victoria 3.0. So the next slide. What is the vision? Well, in part, we're going to be working on that with you, but the best guess we have so far with the steering group that's been working on this for the last year is that by 2030, Victoria is known globally for leadership in the blue economy with high growth, globally oriented companies that anticipate and solve the problems of the 22nd century, creating high value jobs and leaving the ocean and the planet better than we found them when we began in 2020. Or a much more succinct way of putting that, which I think is going to come up on a slide later, is simply ocean industry transformation for the 22nd century. So we're really aiming big and we're aiming far, and we'd love to hear your thoughts today on whether that vision works, but more importantly, as Chris said, how we're going to commit to getting there as industry, government, nonprofit sector, and the educational institutions all working together to essentially grow our ocean economy. That's the thrust. I believe that is all from me. I'm looking forward to participating in the morning.
Well, maybe we could, entice you to share just a few words on this before we get started.
Sure, thanks, Chris. I had forgotten that this slide was coming next. So while the Ocean Futures cluster and the Ocean Futures Innovation Hub are really projects, as I said earlier, for the city, the region, the province, and the country. This is ground zero. This is where we imagine things kicking off. The initial hub will be located in this area. So this is Victoria's Arts and Innovation District. As you can see, some industry, but a lot of underutilized land right there on the ocean. Some, I can't point because it's not my screen, but there are some docks down here. You know, were set up a long time ago. We're ready to roll in a barge and set up a hub right on the barge. So there's a ton of potential. And I wanted to show this slide because Chris is going to show us some slides of his town, Bergen in Norway. And at once upon a time, it looked like this, and now it looks very different. And I think we've got the possibility with the Ocean Futures work that we're all doing together to transform this part of the harbor into something that's going to create jobs, grow companies, and anticipate the 22nd century. So I will leave it now at that. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, and thank you for the opening. So she mentioned you know, the economic development, and right now we're seeing a lot of countries and a lot of regions basically reorienting themselves towards this massive opportunity called the ocean economy. And one of the things that we looked at in our previous workshop was all the different sectors, whether it's shipbuilding, it's tourism, it's military and security, it's environmental sciences, it's offshore wind. I mean, there's a lot of different sectors that are now growing, and we're going to look at some of those as we proceed. Now, the sort of the big picture that we shared last time is basically all of these pieces coming together. And I think that's something that's really important, because as we've been doing interviews and as the teams have been doing interviews, different people want different things. Of course, we're trying to pull all that together. We're trying to develop the city transformation, cluster organization, align startups and scale-ups, but really it's about the ocean industry's transformation. And we're going to start with a example. We're going to hand it over to Tanya, who's joining us from Norway, because as we have had a chance to work on this, we see just an increasing amount of similarities between what you guys are building and what we have been partially involved with in this part of the woods. So, Tanya, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning to everyone. As Chris mentioned, we think there's a lot of similarities to be shared, what we have achieved in Norway, and then especially in the western part of Norway. The city of Bergen has fostered 7 innovation clusters and also a very successful innovation district. But the city of Bergen is a quite small city. It's only like 300,000 people living in the city. But still, it has been the city that has been most successful when it comes to fostering these innovation clusters. And the reason for it is that we have had a very strong commitment. A very strong commitment when it comes from the R&D community, a strong commitment from the industries, a strong commitment from the local government and also from national funding opportunities, and a very strong commitment also to the entrepreneurial community and also the private capital. And this has been really fostering a very high collaboration. And of these 7 innovation clusters, actually 5 of them are related to the ocean industries. And these 5 innovation cluster has now co-located themselves to an innovation district. But as Chris mentioned, if you can, the next slide, please. The city of Bergen has also been through a huge city transformation, and very similar to what the mayor was presenting. 50 years ago, our innovation district was actually an old shipyard. It had tremendous activity also related to the ocean industries. And this is how the innovation district looked back in the 1950s and 1960s. The shipyard industry changed and the activities declined, and the city of Bergen was then left with a lot of infrastructure and had the challenge, how can we transform this area into new knowledgeable jobs and create new value creation out of this region? Next slide, please. So it has been a tremendous development done in this innovation district. It started all with the university. The University of Bergen really needed to set up a high-tech new building for their ocean science-based activities. They needed a very modern facilities for testing, research, student, and researchers. So the university was one of the main drivers to first initiate an ocean house in this district. Secondly, in place, we also saw that we really also need a commercialization engine. So the university, together with the private capital, actually launched a commercialization early stage investment company trying to commercialize the output from the ocean-based R&D community. In 2000, the Innovation District successfully onboarded a very visionary real estate, a property developer, and I will say that is when the real action got started. The real estate development truly shared the vision of the city when it came to transforming this area into a knowledgeable new innovation district. The real estate developer bought several buildings as highlighted, as you can see here in blue, and it started developing in a very rapid pace. The next, I will say, very fundamental step in this transformational process was establishing an incubator, a technology transfer office, the incubator, and a startup community. So that was also one of the next very fundamental instruments to get in place. In 2018, all the ocean clusters, and I was part of the Seafood Innovation Cluster, we took a common decision to move all of our cluster organization into this innovation district. And this, again, was very attractive. Now the gravity was spinning around us. We had a lot of entrepreneurial upcoming new technology companies. We had a strong R&D community in ocean-based science. We had the ocean clusters working there. And that became very attractive also for larger global industry partners. So very early on, the year after, we saw that large global players such as Zoetis, Lerøy Seafood Group, Cargill, multi-billion companies actually took the decision to relocate their business to the innovation district to be close to these up and coming new technologies, the new innovation. It became highly attractive. And what we saw, which is also a very important part of the strategy, is that when we join our forces together, the clusters, the industry, the science, the entrepreneurs, and the private capital, we were also very successful as a consortium to be competitive from receiving funding from national government-supported programs. So that enabled us actually to extract a lot of important funding to reinvest into the innovation district in setting up new testing facilities. So we attracted new accelerators. Hatch, myself, is one of the accelerators that took the decision to move to this innovation district. Ocean Catapult, that also had a presentation last time, is working closely with this innovation district. And last year, we were also very successful in launching a huge new catapult, a test center when it comes for ocean-based technologies. Next slide, please. But even though it has been developing at a rapid pace, maybe in the last 20 years, it has in totally taken 30 years to develop this innovation district. So as you can see from the numbers here, it started with the number 1, and then we organically grew and expanded this innovation district. Now we actually are at the second stage. The innovation district that we first initiated is now fully booked with industry, R&D, government authorities, startups, private capital. And we have now started on the next development stage of the innovation district. So there's actually now a huge new city property development project for stage 2, which has almost a similar in size, where also the National Institute of Marine Research, the Directorate of Fisheries, and several other ocean-based industry will be setting up. So this has been like the first step of transformation. So I think some key lessons to be learned is that definitely have the opportunity to expand. I don't think anyone of the city of Bergen or Norway could anticipate the success of this kind of initiative. Next slide, please. So what we see is that the ocean cluster has been the main factor that we develop in this innovation district. But the ocean clusters, as I mentioned, the city of Bergen has 7 other clusters. So the ocean cluster is also now working very closely with other clusters related to it. We have also a strong energy and technology cluster, a new fintech cluster, a health and life science cluster, highly related to ocean and human health, and the media cluster. All of these clusters has emerged out of the ocean cluster. And what we see now is that we are also now exploring new degrees of innovation and collaboration across these kinds of clusters. And I will give you just one brief example of that, Chris, before I stop here. For instance, we saw for the health cluster, they were using AI as a very powerful technology, a diagnostic tool for cancer treatments. This was something that we were very curious when it came to the fish health side of things. If AI could be used in human health for diagnostics, could we also use the same kind of technology and principle from health to fish health? So that led us actually to establish one of the first new AI projects in aquaculture. So these learnings across different clusters, and we see now emerging new kinds of innovation initiatives across different clusters, fostering and accelerating new innovation into the oceans industries. Next slide. Today, the Innovation District is actually hosting 3,500 employees. So it's definitely all knowledge-based jobs. The shipyard from the 1950s has transformed to be a very successful innovation district, targeting the knowledge economy and very attractive jobs. 150 companies have been co-located to this district. More than 4 billion in revenue in Canadian dollars is now in revenue from these companies. 4 ocean clusters is actually moved here. The 5th one is now actually in the next quarter will also be entering in here. We have set up 3 incubator programs, 5 accelerator programs, and also several large-scale testing facilities. So it has been a huge transformation from the shipyard to what we have achieved today. So I hope this story can inspire the Ocean Hub initiative and also to bring the commitment that will be needed to make this a successful story. Look forward to the discussion later today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And now we're going to transition back to Victoria. And we're going to start the first breakout group in just a minute. And the question I would really encourage you to discuss is, what do we want to achieve? What is our ambition? What is our vision? There are many examples of how these pieces come together around the world, where we have both the cluster organization, the various industry transformation, the startup programs, the educational institutions, and the physical footprint and the real estate development. All of this needs to come together in a way that you would like to see. So we're going to prepare you for the first breakout session. And the question to be discussed is basically, what is our vision for this by 2030? Now, Tanya did refer to a much longer timeline in her case, But I think we're seeing a lot of pieces in motion and a lot of pieces really wanting to come together here. So I think that our timeline can be much, much quicker. So it's a 10-year timeline, and we're going to put you in the breakout groups. And we have prepared something that we call the Ocean Future Innovation Hub 2030 Vision Canvas. And the way that you work on this is either by conversation and discussion with your team leader, and your team leader will make sure to write things down, or if you prefer, everyone can be working simultaneously by putting down their own items. So this can have a lot of input, or it can have a little bit less input. That's up to you. So we're going to split you in 5 groups. So group number 1, team leader is Tanya. Group number 2, team leader is Roberto in blue. Team leader 3, that's Robin. Team leader 4 is Jerome. And finally, team leader number 5 is Sean. So as you now in just a minute get set into groups, just go with the team leader and he or she will sort of guide you to where you're going to be working. And please take a few minutes initially for introduction, get a chance to say hello, make sure everyone's logged in wherever they'd like to be logged in. And for those of you that are comfortable with Miro, just go ahead and work. And me and the rest of the team are going to be right here. See if anybody needs any help, if you fall out, maybe you fall off your chair, who knows, you know, you can always get in touch with us. Adelina, we can go ahead and put people in the breakout groups, please. And we will bring you back in about 20 to 22 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, Chris, I'm going to turn off my camera and eat my breakfast again. You're getting used to this, I guess.
Go for it. Adelina, are you able to send a message to Sean, or are you not able to reach him when he's in the group?
No, you can just send him in the chat.
I don't have access to him.
Oh yeah, okay, he needs to come back.
Yeah.
But they'll be back in 15 seconds.
Yeah.
This is really nice, Chris. I'm watching it a dual screen. It's floating around everywhere. It's great.
Oh yeah.
Great stuff.
Anyway, so I think because the city of Victoria is very much interested in that, that's what a good angle to start.
Welcome, welcome back. Maybe I could ask Sean, you guys looked like you were having a lot of fun. What were some of the key highlights that you guys discussed in your group, Sean?
Yeah, so we had an interesting discussion. Our board is like full. So
It is.
there's a lot of ideas going around, but we're also kind of having a side discussion at the time. And you know, Miro is a good tool for getting everything down, but it's nice that we're able to actually have a bit of a chat. And we did start to get into a bit of that chicken and egg discussion that we're touching on at the last session we had about kind of the real estate need versus the organizational need, and kind of that, defining the structure and aligning the space with the actual organization that this. And it leads to some pretty interesting discussion. Thinking about this vision for 2030 and working back for it, I think it's a pretty key aspect of that is around this organization, and then the need to kind of tie that to a physical space, and some of the needs that physical space and opportunities of having that cluster in a physical space could actually provide. But even though there's a lot of barriers to get to that kind of to have that and establish it due to real estate prices and leases, but once it's there, you can have something that is like more thriving and collaborative space that actually allows industries to network and creates a sense of place within the city too. And Frank in the call kind of noted, you know, in some cities when you're in the garment district, and you know, in this case, vision is you know, being in that innovation hub and kind of feeling the space and the place and actually having that energy tied to it as well. But also that is kind of, you know, part of the long-term play is you're, and Tanya did a great overview of Bergen and talking about, you know, 30 years it took to kind of get to that, you know, the vibrant space that it is today. So also thinking backwards, you know, what is that kind of first step? And it is in a lot of ways based on our last session, which is the organization that we're creating and what are its needs too.
So what would, Sean, if you're going to pinpoint like one thing that sort of emerged very clearly, just one thing, what would that be?
I think it's the innovation, like the term collaboration came out quite a bit, and actually having a big vision for this and aiming big, and that it's, you know, there's a lot that go into it to kind of take it to what it might look like in 2030, but you know, the vision for 2030, looking at the board here, is very focused on international. It's focused on collaboration between large companies and startups. It's focused on addressing some of the problems that, you know, are arising in this industry over time. So it's very future focused, and it's very big picture. It's looking globally and nationally.
Good. Jerome, a quick question for you as well. What were some of the key points of your discussion?
Yeah, similar kind of number one theme pulling out of this is collaboration, if I can put them all under that. And that came out in a few different ways. So first of all, in terms of shared facilities, we're talking about things like physical equipment, specialized equipment, whether that's instrumentation, tanks, advanced printing and whatnot, but also facilitation of finding where that may exist elsewhere. A lot of times the testing equipment might be so specialized that the only location where that is somewhere in Europe. But if you have someone who's got expertise in this and is really tapped into and aware of the global ocean tech community, they may know quickly where it is, what it would cost, how to get the work done there, and facilitate that process for you. So that's just one example. A lot of things around shared R&D. In another category entirely, just in terms of collaboration and shared resourcing, any kind of services that would help get to market, especially international markets, whether that's translation services, just awareness of who the procurement people are at different multinationals that could be purchasers of the tech that's coming out of this research and development here. Things like shared specialized legal support in terms of patents specific to the marine economy. Yeah, just a much greater recognition of all the activity that's happening here in the broader community, South Island, British Columbia, Canada, that there's a great concentration of marine ocean tech in the blue economy here, and that awareness translates to maybe better collaboration with related tech, software development, mathematicians and the like, right? Yeah, those are a few examples. Also, somebody mentioned equitable participation with First Nations stakeholders, that we find this is a space where that could be facilitated as well in terms of the shared resourcing.
So what I'm hearing, and of course we've had a chance to look at all the boards, and of course you guys can as well, is that there's a lot of key elements: collaboration, shared infrastructure, collective go-to-market initiatives, etc., etc. For the next exercise, which we're going to start in just a few minutes, we wanted you to come back to the present day, and we want you to talk about current industry level challenges. And by industry level challenges, we mean what are some of the key challenges that affects many companies or many stakeholders in the industry. So for example, if you have a bad CEO, I mean, it's a genuine challenge, but it's maybe your company's challenge. whereas you have a hard time finding new employees, or you have in the startup space a very hard time finding financing and investor capital. Those are more common or more shared challenges. So we have seen over and over again that good clusters, they solve specific challenges. And I can't emphasize this enough. For the big companies particularly, we need to be able to clearly identify what are some of the challenges that you can solve for me. And if we have a clear sort of roadmap to solutions, then we often get more of the bigger companies, both locally, domestically, and internationally. I'm going to give you a framework that we call an open innovation map. And you can see in the upper side here, challenges that you put in this space on top are industry-wide issues. Regulations, government support, education quality, internationalization programs. These are issues that affect everyone. And then all the way on the bottom, you have challenges that are very, very unique to your specific company. I'm going to give you an example of this. So here we have a cluster, here we have a cluster in the mobility space. So you can see on top in the middle, there's no national policy for autonomous mobility. That is a challenge for every member in that cluster. Equally, there is no national research or funding. Lots of bits and pieces, but there's no sort of overarching umbrella for the national research and funding. There's a limited market access for our suppliers into global markets. Again, it's a challenge that many of the companies share. Or investors are not attracted to this field. Again, this is a challenge that everyone is facing. Some of these challenges are long-term challenges. They can easily take 10 years to solve, and that's okay. While some of these challenges are very, very short-term, they need to be addressed and fixed right away. Down here, we have a couple of examples of specific company challenges. And please feel free to put those in, but those are maybe a little bit less interesting in this conversation. Good clusters are able to identify industry-level challenges and then just attack them to solve them together. When this works, the key companies come back a year later and say, we would never have been able to do X, Y, Z if it hadn't been for this collaboration. We as a company wouldn't have the resources, the networks, the talent, the technology, the time, but only by working with you guys in the cluster were we able to solve these challenges. So your job right now is, well, what are those challenges? So we're going to give you 15 minutes, breakout number 2, same groups. Alina will get you set up in just a second. And we really want you to be able to put in a couple of really, really key industry-wide challenges. Now, Sean, if you guys want to put in the same amount of work, that's fine. You can have like 50 Post-its on this. But if you would like to discuss and have maybe fewer, that's fine too. It's not about the volume, it's about the quality of this. So feel free to have a discussion, but try to identify what are some of the industry level challenges that we would like to bring to the table and see if the cluster can help us solve. We're going to give you 15 minutes, 1-5, and Adelina, you can put us back in the breakout groups.
Yeah.
Thank you. So when people come back from this, we're going to have a quick sort of comment from Tanya, and then we're going to take a 9.5-minute coffee refill before we jump into the structuring detail. But this is a lot of good stuff here.
Yes, everybody is rejoining now. Yeah. 11 seconds.
Welcome back. Maybe I can phrase one question to Tanya, and then we're going to have a quick coffee refill, 9.5 minutes to be exact. But first, Tanya, what were some of the key challenges that you saw, maybe differently from what you've seen in other clusters?
Well, definitely the issue to funding came up. Because all this innovation is also very costly. So of course, who's going to pay for all this innovation? So there was definitely a challenge when it comes to accessing funding for that kind of innovation. And a lot of also focus on private funding, attracting investors, and maybe also specifically investors that are focused on ocean sustainability, more impacted related kind of innovations. Secondly, also challenge when it comes to securing skill-based workforce, how for ocean industries to be attractive for talents, for the best talents that are out there, and really to have that kind of talents to be developing those kinds of ocean industries. And what I found interesting is that there were a lot of initiatives going on when it came to educating young people around the ocean and ocean health. And those initiatives probably also, I think, probably can grow and to be advanced in such an ocean hub and to share that knowledge across different kinds of stakeholders.
Super. Emily, I know you're filling in for Dallas, but you're doing it really well. What were some of the key challenges that emerged in your group?
We had a large conversation around sort of the last half of the conversation was really around positioning ourselves within a pan-Canadian framework and a pan-Canadian strategy, and speaking globally, you know, as a nation, and ensuring that going forward we look at some of the, or at least we make some recommendations to, I think, reconcile the disparity between Western Diversification's funding structure here and ECOA on the East Coast. So that was a major theme because there's major differences there. We also spoke to hoping for more of a provincial presence around strategy and a clear ocean innovation strategy as well. And I think also there was some discussion about some of the deficit around that, the innovation that comes out of the academic spheres, and ensuring that that innovation is aligned. That is, it's funding long-term sort of progress where we see the world economy going, and it's aligned and it's invested in a sort of longer-term vision. I might have captured that a little bit poorly, Kate. I apologize if I didn't quite get the last little bit.
No, this is fine, because, you know, this is not a matter of catching and be done with it. So good cluster, and I can't emphasize this enough, good clusters will continuously actively search for challenges to solve. And when you find those right challenges and you go to work on them, you will find that your members or the companies and the stakeholders are actively getting pulled in and happy to pay the membership fee, and happy to support with project financing, and happy to go back to the companies and actually get budgets for these things. So we have seen many clusters with a little bit of time be able to tackle large projects with company funding, because they're solving very, very real challenges, and sometimes very big challenges. And if those challenges sit at the intersection of technology, markets, and collaboration, there's a good chance that nobody can solve them except for a cluster collaboration model.
Chris, we also spoke about the entrepreneurship layer as well. So I should bring that up because there's some really good points there about the really requiring, not all companies are suited for venture capital, and we have obviously with the sort of makeup of our ecosystem here, a lot of smaller companies. So looking at alternative financing models to support some of the innovation among the smaller companies, and some investment vehicles that would allow that to occur was also a big topic we discussed.
And just to build on that, I would like to see the cluster within its first 3 months, you know, get its act together, go visit the local banks, and get a $5 million micro fund established within the first couple of months. And you know, if you have to twist a few arms, that's what it takes. But we always find that there's money available. You just got to move it out of you know, deadbeat banks and put them into a more healthy part of the ecosystem. And that's a role the cluster can play once you get the pieces together. But hey, that's, I mean, I'm sure you don't have deadbeat banks in Canada. They have in Switzerland. We're going to take a very quick 9.5-minute coffee refill break. When we come back, we're going to get into the structure of the project. We're going to get into the structure of the cluster organization. We need you guys to help us say, what are the roles to fill? What are some of the key initiatives to highlight? And how are we going to put together funding and financing models for this? And that happens in 9.5 minutes. Thank you. I'll see you soon. What do you think, Jerome? Coffee breaks over?
I think so.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's go.
Let's go. So we're going to give you a brief sort of project update, give you a little bit of status and sort of where we are at the moment. And of course, this is a project that's going to evolve and change with you guys as the key stakeholders moving forward. So I'm going to take about 10, 12 minutes of high level introduction. And then we're going to put you back in the breakout groups with the topic of how do we actually design what we call the organizational model or the operating structure with boards and staff and members and topics. So kind of putting that puzzle together. And in that conversation, I would like for you to be very specific because we're talking what are the steps we're doing in the next couple of weeks. But first, a couple of slides on the project status. So this is one slide. The design is not in any kind of way finished, but this is sort of how we're seeing this emerge. So we have the ocean industry transformation really smack in the middle. And then we have 3 pillars. And those pillars ideally get a balance between them, with the innovation cluster being the #1 pillar. That is the foundation that everything else rests on. So the cluster will be hopefully a non-profit membership-based organization, and it will pull all of these pieces together. Then the entrepreneurship programs will be an integrated part or a specific initiative under that cluster. And then we have the real estate development, which of course will happen together with local developers over time. And these 3 pillars are pretty common. They're pretty standard issues, if you will, around similar projects around the world. So for example, the innovation clusters, you really want to have a membership-based organization, which is common. You want to focus on how do we solve industry challenges and how do we collaborate around innovation and technology and new market opportunities. For the entrepreneurship programs, we're looking at an incubator, which is not very complex to operate. We're looking at accelerator programs, which are infinitely more complex to operate, but those accelerator programs, they can be built and run locally, or they can be done together with partners, or they can be done globally. So there are many ways of solving that accelerator part. For example, right now I'm running a large program for Catapult Ocean. Technically, they're based in Oslo. Right now we have 10 companies and they're all over the world, US, UK, Netherlands, Faroes, Sweden, Denmark, etc. So you can run an ocean technology accelerator in Victoria with participating companies being all over Canada, all over the US, or globally. Or you can start inviting them to the region or sending companies out of the regions. Many ways to solve that. Finally, we have the venture fund. We will actively suggest that this hub sets up its own micro venture fund, starting with 5 million Canadian, moving up to 50 million Canadian, simply because it's something that is sorely needed in all of these initiatives. For the real estate, we're looking at co-working space and then co-location over time. Now, if we take the same structure, we look a few years ahead. Here is a picture of what we would reasonably expect if all things align over the next couple of years. The cluster should be able to recruit some 300 members. It's a high number, but there's enough things in motion to make that happen. We should be able to do both collective or collaborative innovation projects as well as new market initiatives. And you know, based on some of our previous work, we have exact playbooks, and there's best practices and there's emerging practices. So it's not a matter of reinventing the wheel, it's a matter of taking good practices and putting them in a structure. On the entrepreneurship side, we should have 30 plus companies in the incubation program, and Julie may join us and say, you know, that's a very low number, which I hope. We should be able to establish 5 Ocean Accelerator programs, or at least connect and collaborate with 5 Ocean Accelerator programs around the world. Some of them are in Washington State, some of them are in Hawaii, some of them are in Singapore, some of them are in Norway, some of them are in France. These Ocean Accelerator programs exist all over the world. They can be built or they can be connected to. Equally, I would indicate that we should be able to get 50 companies in a co-working space. And the co-working space can both be for early stage startups and late stage startups. It can also be for SMBs. It can be for more scientific organizations. It can be for government organizations. So you can see different types of companies coming together. And then finally, we have the test sites, and then this idea of co-location as the real estate gets built up. Now, surely there's going to be challenges thrown in there, and there's going to be a lot of, you know, obstacles, but that's simply a nature of these things. So this would be one indication of the direction and the aspiration that could and should be possible with the Ocean Futures Innovation Hub by 2023. And you can, of course, discuss this in more detail once we go back to the breakout groups. Now, based on the work that's been done with urban systems, the recommendation is really simple. Express path, get started, start building as soon as possible. Some projects like this need to have a multi-year kind of planning phase. Some of these projects need to have a multi-year engagement phase with industry. But what we're seeing is that there's so many pieces that are already in motion that our recommendation is very clearly get started. Establish the first couple of pieces in December this year, and then get the legal cluster organization up and running and have operations in place by early 2021. Last workshop, you gave a lot of indication in terms of what should be the focus, what should be the strategic focus areas. And what you're seeing right here are those 5 strategic focus areas that really came out on top. Industry transformation, which of course is a very wide topic. International market development, so collective go-to-market initiatives for new markets overseas. Developing shared innovation infrastructure with testing facilities and offices. And then entrepreneurship. And finally, as you can see, the investor capital. All of these pieces fit naturally into a cluster structure that we see all over the world. So the first step is to really establish the cluster operating organization. Now, we do have some best practices. We have some bad practices. And we're going to get you guys started on what could that look like in just a few minutes. But before we get you started on that, we're going to show you 2 quick examples, just 2 very quick examples of how does this normally happen. Moving from, hey, let's get a lot of people together and do this, and into actually building the organization, the operating structure. So the first example I want to take is a Norwegian energy cluster. And this is a pretty significant cluster. It's all the big oil and gas energy companies, and they all want to transform at the same time. And in this picture, you have an industry CEO, you have an economic development officer, you have the manager of an incubator, you have the CEO of a large clean energy venture fund, you have a clean energy entrepreneur, you have an oil and gas executive, you have an oil and gas project manager, and then you have the cluster manager. They are basically learning how to build an innovation cluster. And they're doing this by a gamification principle called experiential learning, where they're working through different cluster scenarios to learn what is a cluster, how does it work, and how do we actually move faster into a collective understanding. And this is the kind of work that needs to happen with the cluster board and cluster organization, so we can move from very different individual perspectives and into the shared understanding and the shared principles, and get some of these ideas together as a cluster organization. So in a typical 2-day workshop, we then get into, and this is back when it was okay to actually meet people. So in a 2-day workshop, we typically get into, well, how should the organization look like? And we work into some of the key strategic initiatives. We start putting some names on paper. We start outlining what is the organizational structure that we want. We need a board. We need the chairman of the board. We need the CEO. We need a couple of staff. We need what's called innovation groups or innovation working groups. And then we need to sort of put all this together. Now, this kind of cluster structure can easily carry 300 members. It's quite easy to put 300 different people into the structure once you understand how all the pieces fit. And that's what you're going to be starting on in just a minute. But before that, I want to take one more example that kind of ties this in with the financing, because financing and business model is always an issue. So this is a Norwegian finance innovation cluster. It's, of course, located in Bergen, and it started a couple of years ago. It is a non-profit fintech cluster with a mission to build out a more thriving Norwegian fintech industry. It has a full-time team of 6 people, 5 of these being employed, 1 being an intern. They have a board that you see right here, and half the board members are industry CEOs. So we have Jan Erik, who is really one of the key champions behind this board, CEO banking, founder of a bank, partnership manager bank, innovation director bank. And then you can see some academics. So right here, for example, you have the rector, which is the head of the university for the business school, for the technical university, and from the university. So what you're actually seeing here is that you don't only have the researchers, but you actually have the rectors of the university at the board. And then finally, we have some investors, and then we have a couple of consulting industry managing partners and managing directors. Now, the good thing with this is that each of these board members, they get a chance to pay $25,000 US for the privilege of serving on the board. And this is not industry standard, but this is one way that a smart board will figure out how do we get real commitment and how do we get the financial muscles to get this off the ground. So we don't see a lot of these with the 25K membership, but it is one way of connecting the organizational model to the funding model, and it could serve as an inspiration for what you guys are going to discuss. So we have the operating organization, and Alina, we're going to put them back in the breakout groups in about 2 minutes. So we're going to give you some cards to play around with. These are your different board members or employees. And in your breakout, we'd like for you to start shaping this, putting the cards into the organizational model. For example, would it be wise to have 2 board members? It could be a very efficient board, maybe not ideal. Could we have 10 board members all being female? Again, that would be an option. I don't know if it would be wise, but it's an option. I'd like for you to discuss, what should the board look like? Should we have only industry? Should we have a lot of government? Should we have a lot of startups? Should we have academics? And if we have academics, what level of academics? If we have investors, should they be local investors, national investors, international investors? In our previous workshop, I recommended having international members. Would you like to have international members on the board? That's all part of that discussion. Sooner or later, ideally sooner, you're going to need a CEO or a manager. And I previously called this role superhuman leadership skills required. And then you need to start looking into what kind of people do we need here? What kind of roles do we need to fill? Then we have the strategic initiatives that you guys brought up. So these were the focus areas that you mentioned. So we've plugged these in, and what you're seeing right here is sort of how the strategy gets implemented into the organizational model. So you now see a number of these innovation groups, and you start bringing in more employees. And very important, you tie this organizational model together with dedicating board members with specific responsibility for these innovation groups. So that's your discussion. We're going to give you a couple of givens. So we assume that we're setting up a non-profit membership organization. We assume there's going to be a general assembly. We assume there's going to be a board, management, and operating organization. And then it's up for you guys to discuss what should that look like. And Adelina, I think that we are ready to go in the breakout groups and develop the operating structure. Welcome back. We are not finished with the organizational model. We are going to add a new piece of information. And someone in one of the groups said, we can't really do this. Or Emily, maybe you want to mention what you said in terms of the sequencing of these things.
I didn't say we can't do it. We can do it. I think we had a good discussion around the sequence of doing it. So and Christian, you brought up the idea, I think, of a minimum viable organization, kind of like an MVP. And so how do we establish just in the beginning a sense that, you know, the organization of the first 6 months is probably going to look different than the first few years, and certainly different than, you know, by the time you're into your, you know, 3, 4, 5 year of growth. So there was also some discussion around the revenue model is closely aligned to the governance model. And so we needed to think of some of this piece. And then we said we need to also maybe take a little bit of a step above that and think about the strategy first. So that was, I think, a little bit of what we were sort of talking about. I think we were hesitant to throw out too many specific roles in terms of the competencies and networks and so on needed, but there were some good conversations about all of those topics as well.
No, and Emily, it's fantastic that you mentioned that, because there's really an alignment between the strategy, the operating organization, and the funding capabilities that you have. And one of the 2 examples that I showed you with people in the room, they're actually putting up the Post-its. So what happened at the end of that section, just like you got into in your group, was that the chairman looked at the organizational model they had built, and that model had a lot of people on it. And he turned around to the rest of the board and said, I have just decided to significantly raise the membership fee starting this year. And that was the end, because they realized that, you know, to deliver on the strategy and have the organization, you need to sort of plug the financing as well. So I'm going to give you a super short introduction to how do we usually finance these clusters. We're going to put you back in the groups, and now you can sort of dance, if you will, between the financing discussion and the organizational discussion, and also touch on the strategy discussion, and really get sort of your hands into all of these pieces. Now, as you probably recognize, this is a discussion that can take a couple of weeks, so we have 30 minutes, which is perfect. So welcome to the wonderful topic of financing business models for clusters. It is a very poorly understood topic that we're going to sort of just jump into. So the question is, well, who is paying for all this? And Scott in group number 2, he said, you know, this is going to cost a sweet million. You know, I agree, if we can find someone to pay for it, or maybe 100,000 if that's all we can get. So what we need to build in these clusters are the right types of business models. They are modular and flexible. That means that you're never going to have one gigantic funding source that just keeps you afloat. Every single cluster is a combination of many different funding mechanisms, some that are from the government, some from industry, some from projects. And the best clusters in the world, they may have a very lean operating structure, but they have a very large project structure. So most of the employees are actually project-based for 1, 2, 3 years. And there's a lot of good practices around how do we actually finance these things over time. The most common model, of course, is public funding. The government will pay for it. Done. And in some countries, that is the norm. Government can pay up to 100%. If you go to some of the Eastern European countries, they are now mostly building clusters with a pure government model. It is not recommended, but it exists. You go to Iceland. I was working in Iceland yesterday. You go to Iceland, they have never had any government support at all. Every single cluster is a pure corporate / entrepreneurial financed, and the government doesn't really have a stake in them. Nobody asks for government, so nobody gets the government. Then you can have a commercial model. Now, the commercial model is more on the real estate development. So it's actually financing the real estate and then adding some of the cluster activities on top because it helps the real estate case. So in that case, there's typically banking, financing, and some equity financing involved. And then you have the entrepreneurial. There are clusters in the world that are built exclusively for profit with no government support at all, and they work extremely well, including within the ocean space. So in that case, some of you will be very inspired, or you'll run out, you'll find yourself building a big building, and you'll figure out how do we do this completely entrepreneurial. Most clusters, of course, have a hybrid model, but they have bits and pieces of all of these. So if we look at some of the examples that we've spoken with in this project together, the ocean supercluster in Canada has targeted 50-50 private-public. We look at Cove, little bit more reliant on the public funding, but both public and corporate. We look at the Seafood Innovation Cluster, where Tanya came from. We look at the Norwegian GC Ocean Technology Cluster. These are pretty much perfectly 50-50. There's a government piece and there's an industry piece. And the industry piece is almost always through membership fees. But notice on the right-hand side, there's a number of entrepreneurial structures. So both Catapult Ocean and Hatch are completely privately funded mechanisms through a venture fund, and the venture fund pays for the operation. So you can have 20 people working full-time as long as you have a venture fund structure behind you. Here we have the example of Thor, who runs the Iceland Ocean Cluster. And he's been able to build this completely entrepreneurial with him as the majority owner. And he's doing this as a for-profit entity. This is possible. So we shouldn't rely too much on the government side, but really think about how can we be creative? A little bit of funding from this part, a little bit of funding from this part, and how do we build the strategy and the structure and the financing that combines all this together? But first, of course, we got to figure out, what does this thing cost? And that's quite easy. Every cluster has 4 elements of cost. Number 1, you have the establishing cost. That's a one-time setup cost. Done. Then you have your employees, typically full-time, maybe part-time employees. and that's always the biggest cost. Then you have the operating cost, office space, travel cost, computers, and Christmas parties. And then you have the large industrial special projects. But those special projects, they always come later in the project lifetime. So what we're going to introduce you to are one very simple setup for how do we sort of break down the cost and how do we handle the revenues. On the cost side, we have these 4 elements: startup cost, staff, operations, and projects. And these costs are super lean, super lean. There's very little fat. But of course, that really relies on what are you able to work up on the financing side. Private industry, public financing, project financing, those are, anywhere you look in the world, the most common financing elements. And different clusters, I mean, you can have clusters within Canada that have completely different financing models behind them based on, again, strategy and governance and choices. So in your next breakout, you can dig into these questions around the business model. You know, should we rely on government? Should we go much more entrepreneurial? Should we try to blend together? And I will propose to you that you should be able to set up a venture fund that employs 5 people full-time within the cluster structure. But again, it's modular and flexible. You should also try to put down some, what we call the concepts. We don't expect numbers. Numbers are fine, but we want you to discuss the concepts and the elements and the structure more than the numbers themselves. You may feel inclined to go back to the operating organization and say, based on the discussion on the financing, we can now do the following on the organization. So please feel free, Emily and everyone else, to jump back and forth, because we got to sort of get these things aligned. So we got 30 minutes, 3-0, and this should allow you a good discussion on the financing, the business model, and when the first parties get held. So Adelina, let's get them in the breakout for 30 minutes.
Before we go to breakouts, can I, just a good question in the chat that you might want to answer before we break out. So someone asks, which of the clusters you have listed are the most successful? So have you seen financing models that are more successful than some of the others?
So it really depends on what do we mean by success criteria. The ones that Scott,
can you define what you mean by successful? Is it number of jobs created, number of economic output? Depends.
All of that. Like are the privately funded, you know, doing better than the publicly funded? You know, or is it sort of all the same?
No, it's not all the same, because you know you're going to have different constraints. So if you take more government funding, you need much more reporting, and there's a very different sort of set of rules that apply to you. If you follow the example of a very entrepreneurial cluster, you're much more flexible. And of course, the definition of success is both for the members, but it's also for the equity owners of the cluster. So there's very different mechanisms come into play. What I can tell you is that more or less the norm is a 50-50. So government pays half and industry pays half.
We with Viatech, the operations is and most of the initiatives are fully privately funded, and then the government comes in and starts programs, and those programs always exist as a thing that could fall off at the end of the year, because the funding varies from year to year and could end abruptly. So like you said, they're always a sort of a standalone project, and there's project teams on it, but they're constrained to that funding. So I could see where the 50-50 would work.
Yep. And you know, that's exactly what the Iceland project says as well, because they say we are afraid of taking government funding because you never know when it ends, which is an interesting philosophy. What I can tell you from Norway, for example, so if your cluster has been getting government funding for 10 years, you're no longer eligible. So after 10 years, it cuts off, whether you like it or not, whether you're prepared for it or not. And we have seen clusters that just stop because they were not able to transition. And then we're seeing clusters now that are actively transitioning. So you find all sorts of models. But 10 years is sort of a timeline that most people say, by 10 years, you need to be fully privately funded. If not, you can just close down. So now you
Christian,
have
would you
both.
mind just-
Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a quick question for you. When you talk about the private sector funding, are you including in that sort of real estate sort of related financial contributions, either to buildings or through rents and so on?
Yeah.
You
So,
are,
some clusters like the Iceland Ocean Cluster, they own their own building. So the building rent is a big part of the cluster financing. While the Seafood Innovation Cluster in Norway, they were tenants in the building, and their building footprint was about the size of 5 desks. So very, very small real estate footprint, but a lot of things happening around them. So there's a lot. I mean, there's so many different variables, and there's no one best answer. All right. Wonderful. You have one question, whether we share the slides, and the answer is absolutely. Everything will be shared afterwards. But first, we have a little bit of work to do. You guys up for it? Good. Adelina, let's kick it back to the breakouts for 30 minutes. Excuse me.
Uh-oh, Christian, you've got a cold.
No, I just do this to look cool. Yeah, my kids, the half the class came home last week, and they were all like, "Boom, chill out." But I have 7 hours of these online workshops today, and then I can relax.
Okay, good. Well, you're almost there.
Almost there. 10 more minutes.
How old are your kids?
7 and 9.
Oh.
Chris, we were just having a discussion, and I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on this. We were wondering that model where you said going to the bank to raise some money to start a venture fund, would the return to the bank then be sort of when those companies got sold, or there was some kind of return on investment, or how would that work?
So you would typically have two options. The first option is the bank being a sponsor, and they'll give you the money, which of course may be a little bit difficult. The other is that the bank actually puts money into the fund. So the bank becomes an investor or a LP, limited partner, into the fund. And then when the fund delivers, hopefully, some positive returns, it goes back to the bank as well. We're seeing more and more banks moving into early stage investments. We're seeing more and more banks setting up corporate venture funds. And one of the things that the government of Switzerland did was we needed more venture funding in Switzerland. But instead of going to private people, they went to the banks and said, you better put some money into venture financing, or else we're going to make life difficult for you. And then they got something like 10 million, or no, sorry, 100 million euro, probably blackmailed out of the Swiss banks, but it worked. So there are many ways of getting these mechanisms. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's possible. We can show you many different examples.
And I think also, Christian, that we will also be showing in our business case that we are working on that there are many different ways of setting up these kinds of venture funds. I mean, Hatch, we also as a venture company actually have governments that also has invested in our fund, which actually commits us to actually be reinvesting our fund to local entrepreneurs from that government into that region. So that's also a way to ensure that the government also has return of their investments by using these kinds of accelerator or venture fund as a mechanism.
So we've been seeing some very interesting discussions, and of course there's a lot of pieces. There's a lot of moving pieces. So we're going to give you the last assignment of the day. It's going to take you about 5 minutes. And Adelina, we're going to put them back in the breakout groups to discuss the very last task, which is what do you think should be the first steps? So I'd like every group to come up with 3, maximum 5, but ideally 3 steps. So our suggestions for next steps are boom, boom, boom. Don't make it too complex, don't make it too advanced, but we'd like to have sort of your guidance on what do you see as the next steps. So Adelina, we're going to put them back in the breakout groups. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And the question is really, what are the next steps to get going here? And I'm sure that there's plenty of things we want to do, but first steps. So Adelina, if you want to put it back in the breakouts, we got the last and short section before we close out today.
Yeah. I'm always trying to wait for you to finish talking.
And I'm always
you
talking.
keep telling me. I don't want to.
Oh, we're doing good. We're doing good.
Work on some sort of a key, like a cue, not a key, like a cue.
Yeah.
Whenever I snap my
On a
finger.
radio, like on a radio show, they
Yeah.
added music. You know.
Nobody else. So Adelina will move you all into breakout rooms. Adelina, yeah, you can move them into breakout rooms. They're like, yeah, but I need you to finish talking so I can.
Can you throw me in group 2, Adelina, please.
So, Mayor, if I could ask you,
I was on mute. Good to see you too.
how are you enjoying the discussions?
Excellent.
Good.
Well, I think we've lost a few people because it's noon exactly. So we'll try and wrap it up quickly. We'll just wait for everyone to get back.
Yeah, I can see the last group's coming back, so this is cool.
13 seconds.
Yeah. So we can see people working frantically with clock running down and work to do, but this is good. Welcome back. We have about 2 minutes left before we're going to close out. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Sure. Will you share your screen so we can talk
Absolutely.
about the steps? So we know that we just sent you off into groups to work on next steps, and we'll gather all that up. We wanted to demonstrate to everyone here and also everyone who's attended the last couple of workshops and to everyone who's been working on this since the idea was first hatched. It was October 25th, 2019, that we're gonna move forward. And so while the urban systems hatch, engage, innovate folks continue to develop the business plan for us, which will be delivered on the 30th of November, later this fall before the winter break, we'd like to at least get a sense of the 10 to 20 people who will form the first board. January 8th or sometime early in the new year, we'll get the strategy session for 2021. At that point, we'll have the business case to guide us. And then the aim is to start the entrepreneurship programs, start locating, get a hub set up in Q1 or Q2 of 2021. So thank you for helping to shape the vision. My hope, as I said, maybe at the beginning, or if not at the beginning of session 1, this is a significant contribution to our city and our region's next 100 years. And your companies and your institutions and your support are all part of that. So stay tuned and continue to be engaged, because we will do this. And in order to do it, we're going to need to continue to have everyone's participation. So I'll leave it there. I want to thank everyone for their time. I know it's been a really productive morning, and we'll see us all soon.
Thank you. Emily, you want to close out with a greeting from SIPP?
It's just been a pleasure to go through all the workshops today with everybody. So many great ideas. And I sort of floated around a little bit to see what other groups were doing. It's a very impressive group, lots of amazing momentum. And I have no doubt that this will materialize quickly if we continue to have this sort of leadership. And thank you, Chris, and the team at Urban Systems. And of course, Mayor Helps for your leadership.
Thank you. And then the next steps will be, we have to sort of gather all the data that you guys put in. We're going to structure it. We're going to make sense out of it. And we're going to continue to work on it. And then we hope to see everyone moving forward with this. So thank you for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful lunch, and hope to see everyone again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Chris, yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.